This is our presentation of Rosemary Hennessy's article, Queer Visibility in Commodity Culture. And here in this presentation, we're going to have Emily Peck, Charlotte Starling, and then myself, Evelyn Birnbaum. So some background on Rosemary Hennessy. She received a PhD in English from Syracuse University and has been a faculty member at Rice University for over a decade, spending the latter part of that time as chairman of the English board. Much of her range of scholarship is seen through the lens of Marxist feminism, which is clear in this specific article that she has written. And she's published works on topics from US-Mexican relations to labor, to literature, to film, and to women and gender and sexuality studies.
So this article is structured as a critique, not only a critique of fellow academics within her discourse community, but critique aimed at queer activism groups as well. She starts with 3 significant authors and their subsequent work within the subject, and then moves on to activist groups, outlining her arguments against each. In Hennessy's eyes, both academics and activist groups use misconstrued understandings of what visibility means in terms of queer culture acceptance, and Hennessy is arguing that everyone is missing a vital point, that these identities are only becoming visible through the means they are allowed to, which is through capitalism and commodity fetishization. Using a historical materialist Marxist lens, Hennessy reminds us that we live and operate within these specific systems created by and for the current ruling class, the bourgeoisie and above. It is important to both remember and fully recognize this in order to grasp the ramifications of the system for the queer identity. A part of this is recognizing that the queer identity has been created discursively, partly through the process of commodification. And the queer identity would not be what we know it as today without the effects of capitalism and the subsequent attempts to subvert the heteronormative grasp on personhood and identity through actions and performances such as drag. Furthermore, the queer identity tends to be appropriated and fetishized by this heteronormative ruling class in order to capitalize on a group which rose out of direct opposition to this class in the 1900s. Once this historical context is fully understood by each group, academia and activists, then hopefully they might understand how to subvert these systems in actually meaningful ways. This is what Hennessy aims to bring to the discussion, an understanding of the historical context of the overarching structures of capitalism and the social effects of this on the queer identity as we know it today. And so Hennessy's thesis is that for those participating as a consumer in capitalist societies and economies, the visibility of the sexual identity is often a matter of commodification, a process that invariably depends on the lives and labor of the invisible others. And we must not forget that, or else any attempt to claim new identity or subvert oppressive identities will simply become a part of the process of commodification, as we'll see with the actions of queer activist groups. Now we shall move on to discussing the discourse community as a way to show the development of Hennessy's arguments.
And in our discourse community, the 3 people that Hennessy has identified as having ultimate knowledge of what she's critiquing are Judith Butler, Theresa De La Torre, and Diana Fuss. So first, Judith Butler. Judith Butler is a queer theorist with a PhD from Yale in philosophy. Her general argument is that gender is performative. People aren't born with gender, they're merely born with biological sex. And gender is a social construct. So when we see media, so magazines, TV, Instagram, YouTube, movies, TikTok, etc., we adopt views about how we should dress and act if we want to define ourselves by a certain gender. Hennessy focuses on Butler's idea that drag is a copy of real gender expression, which Hennessy argues ignores the historical struggle that was built on material experience and not societal influence, like the concept of gender dysphoria, which is a very much material experience. Hennessy's focus on Butler's idea of drag as a parody comes from Butler's earlier work and ignores Butler's later idea of drag as a subversive act to undermine heteronormativity, which I found interesting because Hennessy spends a lot of this essay critiquing subversive acts because they play into capitalism and perpetuate invisibility, and that's going to be covered a little bit more in depth later on. But moving on, Butler also argues that discourse is a large part of the social construction of gender norms, so language, how we refer to ourselves and how others refer to us, our labels and how those labels are defined and then in turn define us. This can be, an example of this is the term wife deriving from a female being a man's property. Because while people who still use that term may reject the idea of being property or have reclaimed the term, such as LGBTQ have reclaimed the term queer, it still has the ability to define how society sees us and how we see ourselves. Thus, Butler's argument is that language is a limiting factor in visibility of women and queer people, and in order to achieve visibility, the language of the discourse must be altered. Hennessy's argument, in turn, is that Butler's queer theory fetishizes the material human, and discourse cannot be the only means of enacting change in the system because queer visibility is a social struggle, not a semantic struggle.
The next scholar that Hennessy discusses is Theresa De La Torre. Theresa De La Torre received her doctorate in modern languages and literature from Bocconi University in Italy. In the US, she is a professor of the History of Consciousness Department at University of California, Santa Cruz. De La Torre's main areas of interest are lesbian identities and visibility in literature and film. She uses a political feminist lens and psychoanalytic theory to inform her work. Because her doctorate is in language and literature, she pays special attention to the syntax, word choice, and structure in her work and others. How language shapes our understanding of lesbian identities, specifically women as subjects and objects of female desire. In this regard, De La Torre is more focused on the distinction between how men write about women, not just lesbians, and how women are in a way reclaiming their own bodies, desires, and meanings when they create work that uses language to subvert patriarchal, heteronormative styles of writing. Although Hennessy and her technically belong to the same discourse community, they make very different focuses and approaches to their work. De La Torre does make allusions between race, class, gender, and the systemic structures that hold disparities among them, but she doesn't dive in as depth as Hennessy does. And as such, De La Torre only mentions commodity in her work. She doesn't use a Marxist lens, and it's a brief distinction that she only touches the surface of. Hennessy critiques De La Torre for her historical textual analysis style, seeming to forget that that's ultimately De La Torre's area of expertise and focus. This is Hennessy's biggest critique of De La Torre for not acknowledging racial differences in her analysis of the films in the essay, noting that the visibility of these issues is not a matter of what is empirical there or what the film intends, but the frames of knowing that make certain meanings seeable.
And last but not least, we've got Diana Fuss. She received her PhD from Brown University in English and semiotics and teaches a range of topics at Princeton, but most importantly, in our case, Freudian theory and feminist studies. So Hennessy's critique of Diana Fuss's article, Fashion the Homosexual Look, is centered in the idea that Fuss overlooks key aspects of class and the queer identity. It is true that both Fuss and Hennessy discuss at length the idea of fetishization and how that relates to identity creation and specifically queer identity. However, due to Fuss's decision to use Freud's idea of fetishization and not Marx's, Hennessy argues that Fuss is placing identity within an updated version of the bourgeoisie, as much of Freud's work is deeply rooted in heteronormative and effectively bourgeoisie ideals and identities.
Yeah, so Marxist thought that kind of Hennessy uses to frame her essay and her argument really focus on historical materialism and the commodity fetishism. I pulled out two kind of key quotes that she touches on as she kind of wraps up her article. The first one is, as I have been arguing, to a great extent, the construction of a new homosexual queer spectacle perpetuates a class-specific perspective that keeps invisible the capitalist divisions of labor that organize sexuality and in particular lesbian, gay, queer lives. In doing so, queer spectacles often participate in a long history of class-regulated visibility. So that's kind of touching more on the activism aspect. And then this sort of critique-out intervention into heterosexuality, therefore, does not see sexuality as just the effect of cultural or discursive practice, merely the product of ideology or institutions, but as a regulatory apparatus that spans the organization of social life in the modern world and that works in concert with other social totalities, capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism.
So let's now briefly discuss the differences and similarities between the arguments against the academia presented in the first half of the article and the activism groups discussed in the last half. How has each group either failed or succeeded in their own way of understanding and subverting capitalism's effects on queer visibility and identity? Hennessy seems to think that activist groups do better than academia at recognizing the specific ties to and effects of capitalism, but still miss the mark in ways that do not effectively subvert capitalism, and instead play into the heteronormative ideal or strive to be a part of it. So her key arguments against the academia are as follows. Academia draws upon ideas of identity based in inherently bourgeoisie realms of thinking and generally ignores the overarching structure of historical materialism that we are all functioning within. And her key arguments against the activist groups, unlike academia, these groups pick up on the ties between sexuality and commodification. However, instead of recognizing these ties and subverting them completely, they miss the mark and instead play into the heteronormative ideal or in ways strive to be a part of it. So rather than foregoing consumer spaces and commodity culture altogether, groups such as Queer Nation play into the commodification of their own identity by transforming the queer identity into a cultural signifier, one which people still seek to consume, and thus the commodity remains securely fetishized. And here's a quote from her about the group Queer Nation. The signifier nation signals a commitment to disrupting the often invisible links between nationhood and public sexual discourse, as well as transforming the public spaces in which a heterosexualized national imagery is constructed in people's everyday lives, in shopping malls, bars, advertising, and the media. In seizing the public space as a zone of political pedagogy, Queer Nation, like ACT UP, advances some useful ways of thinking about pedagogy as a public political practice. My concern here, however, is with how their anti-assimilationist politics understands and makes use of the commodity as a part of a campaign for gay visibility. So this group is concerned with invading and disrupting the current heteronormative consumer space in order to bring a new type of desire to space, one which attempts to subvert the current desire by offering itself as a cultural signifier different than the one already known. On one hand, the group is recognizing the ties between commodification and identity, but on the other hand, they play into the heteronormative ideal by becoming it. Through actions such as queering goods to be bought and sold, such as the queer bar chart, they are no longer performing anti-assimilationist politics.
So in conclusion, Hennessy's work in the essay aimed to establish a new critical perspective of how we view and understand queer visibility and identities. She argued that these identities cannot escape the scope of capitalism, and as such, we cannot separate queer identity from capitalism's attempts at commoditizing it. In her final thoughts, she says, this way of reading is not just a matter of widening the scope of what we see, but of starting from a different place in how we see. We need a way of understanding visibility that acknowledges both the local situations in which sexuality is made intelligible, as well as the ties that bind knowledge and power to commodity, production, consumption, and exchange.
Awesome. And that final quote kind of sums up a little bit of Hennessy's idea that we can relate to another article that we read in class, Asmanova's article. Asmanova has a call to action in her article to dissolve capitalism, and Hennessy's critique of all other calls to action in this essay of queer visibility. Those are kind of parallel thoughts because they both argue that current forms of resistance are capitalist, and they share this idea that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So you cannot effectively protest from within the system because you're using the tools of the system. So calls to action that are mentioned in Asmanova's article, taxing the rich and benefit shifting legislature, or in Hennessy's article, wearing queer clothing as resistance, those kinds of calls to actions are not effective because they play deeper into capitalism, and the capitalist system itself needs to be dismantled to end queer invisibility, to end class struggles, and to end other oppressions. And I want to finish this presentation by acknowledging that Hennessy's essay and her critiques are over 30 years old. This is kind of outdated stuff. I mean, while some of the ideas have held over to our current understanding of queer representation and visibility, the separation of material and philosophical theory for this issue is outdated. For example, gender dysphoria is a material experience, and our understanding of gender is affected by how it is displayed in the media. So the latter being a philosophical and gender dysphoria being material. They are not mutually exclusive ideas but they are presented to be as such in Hennessy's article and in Butler and such. So if you are interested in a contemporary Marxist view on gender and queer politics, I would suggest looking at this YouTube video that's sourced here. And it is of a conference at the Marxist Festival in the UK in 2017. And it is led by keynote speaker Sue Caldwell, who discusses some of these similar topics of our current understanding of Marxism having been evolved and developed in terms of queer visibility and understanding our gender and what is important. I mean, especially Butler, who was one of the main discourse community members that was focused on in this article. She focused on like lesbian and political feminists and not necessarily queer identities as a whole. So it has changed a lot. So I would recommend watching that YouTube video and that speaker.